Again, so glad you can join us today. My name is Charlene Margot, and I am founder of the Parent Education Series and co-founder of nonprofit, The Parent Venture. We are here today with a very important topic, and we know by the response from you all in the community, both in the Bay Area and across the nation, that this is important. Why do health risk behaviors and the perception matter? This is what we're going to be talking about today with Becky Beacom. Before I tell you a little bit about our presenter, I want to say that this event is sponsored by the Sequoia Healthcare District, Peninsula Healthcare District, and the Parent Venture. It is actually a combination parent forum and parent cafe, which is a virtual parent discussion group that we started about a year ago when COVID began. So we've enjoyed really great conversations over this past year, featuring experts like Becky today, and you all engaged. So today we are in a webinar format. So we ask that you use the chat button for comments to us and to one another, but please put your questions in the Q&A button and keep them brief if you can. We're going to try to get to as many of your questions as possible. So today, Becky will be speaking for about 40 minutes, and then we're going to have time for questions again from you, the audience. If you have questions during the presentation, feel free to put them in the Q&A button. I will be moderating the discussion. I promise to be looking at all of your questions as they come in. Today's program will also be video recorded by our partners at the Boys and Girls Club of the Peninsula. So thank you to Jacob Crowell and the media production team. They've been with us for several years, both in person and for virtual events, doing our event videography. So we are very grateful to them. And again, thank you to our sponsors, Peninsula Healthcare District and Sequoia Healthcare District. All right, let me get started and tell you a little bit about today's keynote presenter. Becky Beacom recently retired after 40 years as health educator and manager with Palo Alto Medical Foundation. Becky began her professional health education career as a prenatal and parent educator for Palo Alto Medical Foundation and Children's Health Council. 25 years ago, she became manager of health education and community outreach at Sutter Health, PAMF. Since then, a majority of her work has been dedicated to serving the emerging health issues within Palo Alto and its surrounding greater communities, developing collaborative partnerships with schools, parent leaders, cities, and local agencies, and leading or actively participating in numerous local adolescent health initiatives. In the past 11 years, Becky's work has focused on emphasizing mental health and suicide prevention efforts in Palo Alto. She helped found Project Safety Net and the HERD Alliance, and engaging local high school students in classroom discussions of norms, perceptions, and health decision-making. Becky is also a member of the Wellness Advisory Council of the Sequoia Union High School District, so very active in many of the initiatives that we, the Parent Education Series and the Parent Venture, participate in. So, Becky, take it away. Can't wait to hear what you have to say.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Charlene, for inviting me to engage with parents on this important topic. And so I'm going to share my screen and we'll look at the agenda. Let's see. Oops, 1 second. Sorry. Yep. Go back to here. Sorry, I'm not seeing the, oh, okay, here we go.
Okay, and Becky, also, I've got Spanish just set up, if you don't mind putting yourself on English.
Oh, okay, let me do that quickly then. Okay.
Hopefully Trini will be able to hear us this time.
Let me just get out of stopping the share here. There we go.
Sorry about that.
Sorry, everybody. There we go. Okay, now to share screen. Let's see. Thanks for bearing with me from beginning. Okay.
Perfect.
There we are. So when we titled this, first of all, welcome everybody. And this is hard for me to not be interactive, but we have a lot to cover. So forgive me if I speak fast. And again, Charlene, you're going to keep me on time so that we make sure we have time for questions. So we'll toggle back and forth. But when we titled this, we put that in quotes because basically there's a lot of discussion around what is a typical teenager, or often you hear that saying, well, it's a typical teen. And we get a lot of perceptions about youth through stereotypes and that sort of thing. So today we are actually going to look at, do we know what a typical teenager is? We're going to be looking at norms and where do we find that out? We're looking at that through data. But before we get into all of that, we actually want to start with a perception poll. We're going to start with some questions for you parents out there. And there's about 8 questions. We're going to go through them quickly. And what I want you to do is know that everybody gets it right, because we're not looking for the right answer. We're looking for, what are you thinking? What are our thoughts? And how eventually we'll, in the conversation, look at why that matters. And then from there, after we debrief those, we'll look at what are we hearing from teens. And I'll get to make my case that perceptions and health decision-making are linked, and why that matters to youth, why it matters to us as parents and communities, to schools. And we'll briefly talk about some opportunities that this opens up for you, and then we'll have questions. So hopefully that sounds good. I'm going to leave it on this screen, and Charlene, you're going to take it away and run the poll.
All right, everybody. I just launched the poll, so on your screen you should see typical teenagers in progress. Please do feel free to just go ahead and answer each of those 8 questions now. We'll give you a couple minutes to do that. Well, actually not a couple minutes, but probably more like 1 minute.
Yeah, these should be they're pretty straightforward.
And again, your first impressions are fine. Don't try to figure out exactly the right answer. As Becky says, we're really just after talking about perceptions today. So that's 45 seconds. I think we'll give you another, let's see how we're doing. Give people maybe a few more seconds. Hope everybody is able to see the poll. All right. That's about a minute. Becky, do you think a few more seconds?
Oh, no. Well, are they seeing all of the questions? Because all I'm seeing is the first one still.
Yes, they're seeing all of the questions.
Okay.
Just keep scrolling. Great. We see people all the way down to question number 8. Super.
Oh, cool.
Giving you another few minutes. I know these are interesting questions to consider. All right, about another 10 seconds, everybody. See the numbers changing? It's so interesting.
Yeah, this is great.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. This is fun. Fun way to, I was going to say Friday, but it's not really Friday, is it? It's Wednesday. All right. Okay, Becky, so I think 2 minutes, that's it. Shall we end the polling?
Yep.
Okay.
If you're comfortable with that, we can work with it.
Yep. So now we're going to share the results.
So, okay. So I might need you to read those to me, because I may only see that first one still, Charlene, and that's going to be important as I debrief this. So the first one I'm seeing is that we have about almost 2/3 are parents of teens, and about 1 out of 5 are preteen parents. And then we have some educators, health professionals, and community members in there too. Okay, so on question number 2, the majority of people get most of their information on teens from parent education programming. We find that interesting, followed by my children and their friends and other parents. A few people noted news and social media and books, but again, 35% mentioned parent education programming. Okay. With regard to which groups of high school students have higher reported use of alcohol and drug use, the majority of you, 70%, reported current high school students. Okay. 30% noted high school students from the 70s. Okay. So most of you thought that the rates were higher for millennials and Gen Z. With regard to question number 4, what percentage of US high school seniors used marijuana in the past year? Most of you,
the majority of you, actually, it looks like a tie, noted 40 to 50% or 60 to 70%, with others noting 10 to 20, 20 to 30, and higher. So most people.
Could you look at above 50%? And what's the total that guessed above 50%? Sorry.
About 55% voted 50 and above.
Okay.
So it was 20% went for 40 to 50%, and 20% went for 60 to 70. So sort of slightly less than the majority and slightly more than the majority at the midpoint.
Great.
Okay. With regard to question number 5, teens are waiting longer to have sex than they did in the past. This again was very close. 52% of you said that's true, and 48% of you said that's false. So pretty even split on that one.
Okay.
Question number 6. Most US high school students disapprove of vaping nicotine. Most disapprove of vaping nicotine. 37% of you said that's true. They do disapprove. 63% of you said that's false. They don't disapprove.
Okay.
All right. And now question number 7. Do you or would you allow your teen and your teen's friends to drink alcohol in your home? 20% of you said yes. 63% of you said no. And 17% of you were on the fence.
Okay.
And the last question, kind of a broader range here. What percent of parents do you think allow their teens and their teens' friends to drink alcohol in the home? And Becky, I'm just going to go down the list with you here.
Okay.
9%, 0 to 10%. 15% said 10 to 20%. 20% for 20 to 30%. 11% for 30 to 40%. The largest response was 40 to 50% with 25% of you. And then another 15% of you noted 50 to 60%, and a few, 4%, 2%, 5% noted 60% and above. No one said 80 to 100%.
Okay. All right.
Okay.
That sounds great. I'm ready.
I'm sharing those results now. All right. Thank you.
Okay. So I clean this out now. There we go. Well, first of all, thanks everybody for playing along with that. I'm as excited about your responses as I am when I'm in front of students. And in the past few years, I've been working in classrooms in local schools and their health classes. So it's been really, really fun. So we'll process this. Let's see. So basically it was that first question was helping me understand who's here. And it looks like the majority of people that are on the webinar today are parents of preteens and teens, with a couple of other health professionals, educators, and community members. And but that'll help me focus what we talk about. Interesting about, it looks like there's a wide variety of where people get their information on teens. And I'm not surprised, because you're on a Parent Venture webinar, that there would be so many of you who say that is where you get a lot of yours. And I know that, Charlene, you've been particularly prolific. So I want to appreciate how much you've been helpful to educating parents, and that will help with perceptions as well. And we'll talk about some of those other areas and why it might matter when we're talking about where our perceptions come from. So now we're going to get to some of we're going to use data today, and some of that's going to be national. When I have it locally, we'll use local highlights and some state data. On this one, which group of high school students has higher reported use of alcohol and drugs? The actual scientific answer to that is the high school students from the 70s. And this next slide is going to show you, we're going to look at alcohol, that first one. You see that trend. Actually, let me set this up for you. Monitoring the Future is a national data gathering survey that is out of the University of Michigan. It's funded by the National Institute on Drug Abuse, NIH as well. And they've been tracking teenage behavior related to alcohol, tobacco, and other drugs and other risk behaviors since 1975. Every year, they survey about 50,000 students. So we have very good data from them. And you see that trend. This is regular users of alcohol in 1975. If you're looking at the red trend, those are seniors, blue are sophomores, and eighth graders are in green. Regular users of alcohol, about 3 out of 4 high school seniors were regular users of alcohol in 1975, and we're down to about 30 something now. Still a concern, but definitely this is new information when I'm talking to students or parents about this trend, that alcohol use in particular has been going down every single year for more than 2 decades without change. When we look at cigarettes, everybody kind of gets this one. You see that similar trend, though, to almost nothing. And again, even locally, we have even smaller numbers than national data.
Becky, can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Several parents have written in to say, is vaping included in your tobacco numbers? I don't believe it is. Could you clarify?
No, these, and we will get, I'm going to try to give you a highlight or a smattering of different health behaviors that we've surveyed. This one in particular is cigarettes, but we will show you vaping because I know that's of front of mind for a lot of people. Marijuana followed a similar trajectory. And I'm, again, just using these 3 as examples of this overall message that youth have been decreasing their use for 2 decades. Marijuana is a little trickier, and it's fun to talk to students about how do you explain this? How to explain the increase in marijuana? We often ask them, do they think marijuana is increasing or decreasing at their school? If we have local data, we use local data. If not, we look at national data. But this overall trend of increasing health and decreasing youth has been talked about for decades, but it doesn't make the press. And it often doesn't make it into the conversation in classrooms or in homes. And I'm going to make the case that we need to be talking about this too, the whole picture. So looking at marijuana, what % of high school seniors in the United States use marijuana in the past year? Your answer to that question, let's see, where are we here? Sorry. More than half of you thought that it was the majority behavior of students. You thought that it was the norm. In fact, the answer is that about a third, a little higher than a third, say they've used marijuana in the past year. And if you look at the data on current users or 30-day use, it's even lower than that. So the takeaway on something like this is that 1/3 of students using marijuana is significant. And yet at the same time, almost 2/3 of seniors, 18-year-olds, say they have not used in the past year. And I'm comfortable talking to parents about this because I know you guys are living the reality that a lot of this is just messy. It's not clean. It's not all one way or the other. It's not all black and white. It's not good. It's not bad. We hang out in the middle. And this is what we talk to students about too, that health decision making is messy. There's a lot involved. Teens are waiting longer to have sex than they did in the past. And the majority of you were accurate in your perceptions around that. And if we had more time to process with an audience, it'd be very interesting to examine where our perceptions come from and kind of break things down. This is what we typically do in class with teenagers. But this is very recent data from the Guttmacher Institute, and I have all of these resources for you at the end so you can check it out for yourself. But that's good news. And not surprising, lots of other things have fallen too: pregnancy rates, abortion rates. Good news. Students are making healthier decisions than they have in recent decades. most high school students disapprove of vaping nicotine. This is Monitoring the Future from 2017 to 2020. Let's see, we're looking at 2/3 or higher, whether you're an 8th grader or a senior, disapprove of occasional vaping of nicotine. And when you look at regular vaping of nicotine, that has, it even increases higher. So these are important questions to ask students, not just do you use or not use, but to actually explore their attitudes. And in fact, when you're working with teens, one of the things that can be even more powerful than use rates, to them, it matters what their peers think. So reflecting this kind of data back to them can be very powerful. Even though vaping is of concern, it's important to note that students are concerned and about their friends or about anyone using nicotine or any kind of vaping. So, and we're going to process that a little more. Do you allow your teen and your teen's friends to drink alcohol in your home? You guys, let's see. Let's see. I'm going to look at that. Yes, 20%. No, 63%, and on the fence, 17. So that's who we've got in the room today. I'm not surprised by that number at all. It can vary depending on your audience. But when you start thinking about your peers, it's kind of all over the map. But it does look like the majority thought about half, it sounded like. Is that right, Charlene? 25% thought about half, some a little bit less. Didn't seem like people thought it was the majority. The reason I included this one is that we actually asked this of parents. We were working in Palo Alto on a drug and alcohol project for a number of years. And it was really interesting information. It's sort of an example of what we found out in Palo Alto anyway, was that this was a perception. People leave and their kids party and the parents are okay with it. This was a common refrain. And so when you're perceptive and you're working on a project, it's important to include those kinds of questions on your survey. So we asked this of parents on a parent survey, or when we were doing presentations, and we found out that only about less than 10% of parents in Palo Alto said they allowed their teen and their teen's friends to drink alcohol in their home. So 90% said they did not, but they were all over the map and thought that most parents did allow that. And so it was important not only to work with students, but to help correct some of those perceptions, because it turns out that it really matters what we think other people are doing. So why is this important? It's important because it turns out that science has shown for about the last 2.5 decades that misperceptions can actually be hazardous to your health and contribute to problematic behavior. And what we've also learned is, and you probably know this intuitively, we probably talk to your kids about it all the time, one of the most powerful predictors of how we behave, whether we're teenagers or college students or above, is what we think other people in our social or cultural group, how they behave or what they approve of. But here's the deal. There is this tendency, and this is what we're going to explore today and what we explore with youth, is that there is this phenomenon that we tend to overestimate our peers' involvement in those behaviors. And we tend to underestimate the health that exists in our community, whether that's a school or college. It's the data is solid on this. And the problem is that because we are social and cultural beings, and teenagers and college students even more sensitive to this, that we're more likely to participate in behaviors that we think are expected of us or that are normal and acceptable by our peers. So looking at finding out, what do people approve of? How do people behave? And also asking questions about our perceptions of use or behavior turns out to be really important in official efforts to curb risk behaviors. So correcting those misperceptions about what is truly normal and what is truly extreme, ends up being important to the work that we do. So here's a slide I want to show you, because when I work with young people, one of the things that we do in the presentation is ask, so what influences health decision making? And what you're seeing on the screen are things that are actually out of the mouths of babes, actual students in Menlo Park in particular, but also Palo Alto, that came up with this list as we process. And you can see it's huge. And at the very bottom in red is the perceived norms. That's something they usually don't talk about, but we know of all those things, it's one of the most powerful. It's not the only, and it doesn't work on every single person. Some people, their culture is going to matter a ton, or their family, or students even said, I'm an athlete, and so I'm really careful about what I do with my body, or I'm going to perform and I need to. So I consider that when I engage in health decision making. But you can see this very important list of pop culture, religion, marketing or advertising. Social media pops out huge in their comments. Money, affordability, options like avoiding DUI, using Uber. That's okay if you've got money. For students who don't have access to that kind of income, may have to resort to different kinds of mitigating opportunities. So I'm just putting this here so you can see that this is just one piece, and it's only one piece that we're exploring today, which is the perceived norms. So I'm going to use data, and I hope you like it, and I hope you can see it the way I do, because we don't have the students in front of us. I'm going to reframe it from data to student voices, because thousands and thousands of students in the Bay Area answer questions every other year on a California Healthy Kids survey and local surveys. And that's what we're going to look at and honor the contributions that students have given. And these are just highlights. So here's a vaping one. What percent of US high school seniors regularly vape? This is from Monitoring the Future, 30%. Another way of looking at that is, while that is of concern and we are working hard to make that decline, it's also important to recognize as we look at this and engage in the effort, 7 out of 10 students are making a different decision. And it's part of that whole equation. We'll talk later about how you bring that into the discussion.
Becky, do you mind clarifying what Monitoring the Future is?
Yeah, Monitoring the Future is the same one that I mentioned earlier at the outset, which is a large survey annually every year. Students across the United States in public and private schools, around 50,000, that tracks data. Now, the reason you only see this little bit is that vaping is new. And so they started, surveying for this in 2015. But it's a very, very large database. It's considered, along with the youth risk behavior surveillance, the two top. It's the one that the CDC used when you all heard about the concern about vaping increase, which was the largest increase of any kind of health risk behavior, alcohol, tobacco, or other drug in the history of the survey. So this is of concern. And one of the things, like if we had to end this conversation right now, I would say to you, one of the things that I think is critical for us to balance, whether we're parent, an educator, student, is that we have to be able to balance two truths at the same time, that the seriousness of an issue is not necessarily, it definitely should not be confused or conflated with the prevalence. And we have a tendency to do that, and that's where misperceptions come from. And again, peer behavior, peer perception is super powerful when students are making their decisions. So here's some local data, Palo Alto Unified and San Mateo Unified. Looking to the left on lifetime vape for Palo Alto, we see different responses at different schools. When I look at this data, I see an increase. And when we get subsequent years, I know there was a lot of engaged families and professionals in 2019 and 2020. We'll see what happens with the next round of data. COVID is involved in there, so it's going to be interesting these next 2 years of data. When I look at San Mateo Unified, They chose to survey all 4 of their classes instead of just 7th grade, 9th grade, and 11th grade. And they chose to do it every single year. And it's very interesting data. At those schools, what I'm seeing in this data is basically their vaping stayed flat. It is what it is. It's still lower than the national level, but I would love to talk to those students about how they explain and the schools about how they explain that basically flat did not increase the way that other schools have. So this also speaks to the value of local data and speaking directly to your students instead of, if you have the luxury of using that versus national data, which may or may not be indicative of what's actually happening in your community. Here's marijuana. We saw that earlier, just wanted to highlight. This is 30-day prevalence. So less than a quarter of high school seniors are current users of marijuana. That's good news. We care about those 22% too. So we'll talk about how do you do both? How do you do justice to both? But when you're working on this, it's important to remember that. And it's also provides an opportunity to open up conversations with students, with your own child. Here's a number of, we've got Mountain View, Los Altos, Palo Alto Unified, Sequoia, and San Mateo. Again, I know I'm going fast, but when I look at this slide, I see that Sequoia isn't using California Healthy Kids, but we do know, because we work with that district, that they are starting up again. So that's going to be exciting. So we're missing some data there. Mountain View started a little bit later, but Palo Alto and San Mateo have been using California Healthy Kids, and we get the benefit of that by looking at this trend data. Look at those 2 schools, little different numbers, but the trend is exactly the same. Mountain View and Sequoia are a little more flat. Just speaks to the local data and why it's so important, especially when you're talking to young people. They care about their school. Menlo's going to care about Menlo. Woodside's going to care about Woodside. Pally and Gunn, they see differences. So this local data is important. This slide also tells me this is very valid data because it's so similar, even across. So as parents, you know this dichotomy, right, about development with babies and children, 2 opposing things. Development is a very powerful thing that works across all children in a predictable way. And yet we also know there's huge variations in terms of our own individual children. So I'm going to ask you to hold that dichotomy in your mind as we look at what seem like they might be opposing realities, when in fact they coexist. So this is interesting to share too. This is the national data on attitudes. And again, attitudes being even more important to young people than use rates in some cases. When I look at this data, it tells me over time, high school students have decreased in their disapproval of marijuana. We know that's true. You see that trend line. And yet, 63% of seniors still say they disapprove of regular use of marijuana. So again, and sometimes it's even easier to talk to teens when you've got, how do you make sense of this? Instead of it all being one way. Sometimes hanging out in the messiness really works when you're talking with them. Now I'm just going to move, again, highlighting different health risk behaviors. DUI is very interesting, and I want to use that data to talk about how questions can be used as interventions. This is a slide that shows the decline in alcohol-impaired fatalities related to teenagers or under 21. When we show this slide with teenagers, they get it. They talk about, well, yeah, well, all of the education campaigns, but also the engineering in cars has contributed to this. So they get this. But the one thing that's interesting and I get to share with them is that NHTSA looked at all of those things and they found that there was still some sort of unexplained component attributed to teen decision-making that helped bring about this decline. We still need to work on this. It could still, 1,064 deaths is still something to work on in a major way. And we hope that it can continue to go down. But it's important to show this to young people. The question about, okay, that data is nice and solid, but again, asking students about their decision-making and what gets in the way of the safer decision-making is important to ask so that we can work on reducing that even further. This came from a classroom, just a sample. Almost 2/3 of students said they were strongly against DUI and they had good options. Over a quarter said that they didn't want to, but they weren't sure if the alternatives were realistic. We know from health education that people can't access safety behaviors if they don't believe those are reasonable to them. They don't have the money. They're fearful for some other reason. So that 27% is an opportunity to engage those students in a conversation and say, let's talk about those alternatives, or the 9% that said it depends on the driver. That's an opportunity for education. This slide speaks to, are we asking the right questions that can actually help us turn the dial down on really scary behavior? This came from a survey that we created in Palo Alto. This is old data, but it's still interesting, where you can use a survey as your, almost as an intervention. In this case, we gave students a bunch of opportunities to look at safety strategies and asking them, how likely are you going to use these? And the top 3 up there really speaks to peer culture and caring about each other, and reflecting that back to them was really important. But look at the bottom. If that highlighted in red, only 1/3 of them said they would call their parents. When we polled parents, the majority of parents said they thought their kids would call them. So this was actually a conversation starter that we developed to have parents and students go over this data together and try to work some things out. We wanted to know about avoiding alcohol use in general. And so again, another example of strategies that students could read about and then decide how likely am I to use that. This was an important one. An important question is, if you ever got behind the wheel or rode with a driver who'd been drinking, what got in the way of you making a safer decision? And you can see the options that they got. But knowing I'm talking to parents today, this was important to highlight. This is an opportunity to reopen this conversation, and that's one of my suggestions when we get to opportunities. I'm looking at time here. I got to go fast. Sexual health. We talked a little bit about that. This is the pregnancy rate going down. But why I want to talk to you about this specifically from the context of sexual assault and perceptions. I'm going to borrow from some work that Alan Berkowitz did on norms and sexual assault, starting with this perception that, well, gee, nobody seems to be intervening or saying anything. I guess they must be okay with gay jokes, ethnic slurs, aggressive sexual behavior. He studied that with students at UCLA and other colleges, asking specifically young men, how did they feel about these kinds of behaviors? And far and away, the norm was they were not at all comfortable. But when you followed up with a perception question of, what do you think the majority of your male peers believe? There was this huge underestimation and belief that their peers were more comfortable with it. So I wanted to test this on a campus, 2 campuses in Palo Alto, where this was a hot topic. It was an article that came out about rape culture, and there was lots of work around that, but I wanted to explore this one phenomenon. So we started asking students, what's in your heart? They had presentations on legal consent, but this was a question about what's in your heart. True consent from both partners is essential. And this is just an example, but I probably have over 3,000 student voices on this. over about 90% of them strongly believed. So when you combine that with somewhat believe, you have 100%. Now I want you to follow what happens when we then ask them the follow-up questions about how do you think most students on your campuses would answer this question? Then looking at how do you feel most young men would answer on your school campuses and how most young women would. Watch what happens in terms of this very strong norm of strong belief and when they start thinking about their peers. Here's what they said about most Pally and gun students. 62% felt that most, strongly believed in that, but it definitely dropped from the individuals there. Let's look at men, what they said about most men. Only about a third of the students responded that they thought most men felt that way. 60% felt that it was somewhat, and even 5% believed that the majority of Pally and gun men did not believe that consent from both partners was essential. Females, it went way up. And although this was just one class that I'm showing you, this is very representative across 3,000. And I do want to tell you, we got a number of 100% of strongly believe. And I had students break into applause for each other when they saw that. They don't see this kind of data, and it's important to ask them. And why is it important? Because if you don't believe, I'm going to go back, if you believe that, especially if you're a young man, that most of your peers do not believe in consent, the likelihood of you intervening to prevent a sexual assault goes way, way down. And it just doesn't, it's discouraging to them to believe that. There have been some very interesting conversations with young people. We followed up with this then to reinforce it. I would respect a student who spoke up or stepped in to prevent a sexual assault. This one's actually even a little lower than sort of the typical, but it was an actual survey set. 90% or higher strongly agree with this. It would be interesting to explore the 2%, and my expectation is that there's something very interesting there. Don't have an answer for you on that. So things that we don't look at on surveys, but I think are really interesting, we've explored with students along those same lines, the concept of beauty, height, skin color, eye shape, weight. How do our beliefs about that affect health decision-making? We have students explore these in groups. A belief, there's only 7 good colleges. Do you believe that? Where's it coming from? Oftentimes we'll hear students say, I don't believe it, but I feel it. And so then they ask, so what are some of the decisions that you might be making that can affect your health? They'd come up with things like, well, I might not be taking the courses that really fill my passion. Or I might lose sleep because it's so hard to get into those good colleges. So, but the devil's in the details on all of this and in the conversations, and that's where perceptions shift. It's not safe to ride, walk to school. That could be true in some neighborhoods, but that fear, if it's not, that can also, it's just an example of how there are other perceptions and common discussions out there that can make a difference in health. Mental health, almost done. How are we doing, Charlene? I've got can I take 2 more minutes?
Yes, you can.
Okay. Real quickly, mental health isn't something that lends itself necessarily to things like alcohol and marijuana and vaping, but it does lend itself in terms of, do we believe that people would support us? In Palo Alto, when we were working with the 2 suicide clusters, CDC came out and we were able to do some community surveying. And we were aware that we kept hearing this message, nobody cares, or stigma exists. And we were worried that that would affect help-seeking behavior. So again, you have the opportunity to survey that and create questions that allow you to address it. So we asked, these are student responses from a student group. I would support a friend who needed professional help for depression. 100% agreement on that. When you ask them what they thought how other students would respond, you see that again, that underestimation. When we ask the entire community in a survey that same question, look how beautiful that is. When you look at the bottom two, which are youth, age 16 to 19 and 13 to, still you're looking at close to 100% of people saying, I will support you if you need help. Being able to reflect that back reinforces that behavior, corrects those misperceptions, extremely powerful. So are we asking the right questions? Here's a beautiful way to say there's more to teens than just their risk behaviors. This comes from the Developmental Asset Survey, where this is what students said. It's quite or extremely important to me to help other people. 90%, 9 out of 10 students. Reduce hunger and poverty in the world. 7 out of 10. Make sure everyone's treated fairly. Almost 9 out of 10. Speak up for equality. 85%. Everyone should have the same rights and opportunities. Get to know people of a different race or ethnic group than mine. Stand up for what I believe, even when it's unpopular. 85%. Accept responsibility for my actions. When I make a mistake or get in trouble, tell the truth even when it's not easy. Those are beautiful questions. The students deserve to see how many of them responded. And what that tells me is that there's great stuff happening in homes and in parenting, because that's where that comes from. Those are values. And communities can reinforce those. So are we saying that we don't have a problem? No. We're saying do the whole equation, be honest. We are challenged to integrate two truths. These concerns that we're talking about are real and they demand our attention. And that's exactly why we need to pay attention to norms. And we know that the majority of students are making healthy decisions. It's how do you communicate that is the challenge. Seriousness of this problem can't be confused with the prevalence. Here's why it matters to you. We can be carriers of those misperceptions, and the full picture allows us new conversations with our young people. We get to address a very real risk by looking at these norms. And if you have a child who's in trouble with any of this, it helps us know that that child needs help, and they tend to get it earlier. For young people, more of the same, but it's honest, it's a non-judgmental look at their culture, their generation. It's a mirror, basically. It honors their contribution to surveys. And let's see, what am I saying? I'm trying to go fast here. And it lets us close that gap. And if we do, it lowers those risk behaviors. Students are more likely to help each other, and it's a more inspiring approach. And we know that kids really do need less discouragement. There's been a couple of really tough years. So the opportunities for all of us, challenge those perceptions as parents. Trust your own gut and your knowledge of your child. Too many stories of parents saying, I think my child needs help for depression or for alcohol or drug use or whatever it is. And we hear, oh, don't worry about it. You know, that's everybody's doing it, or even serving alcohol. Everybody's doing it. You know, you should do this too. Trust your gut, and knowing that this phenomenon exists of overestimating risk and involvement will allow you to get your child help earlier if need be. It allows new conversations, and you can start with this presentation. I would recommend also connecting with other parents, whether that's at formal structures or informal. The more connected we are, the less we tend to misperceive. And that's true for young people too. Honor your students' contribution to the surveys. Ask students, make sure that the schools are continuing to collect this data, customize it for your own local community, and request that that data be shared and not just released, but actually looked at. Work with students to develop a narrative. There's big dividends on, you know, it opens up conversations, it corrects their misperceptions, it teaches them about social science, and also health classes and our conversations and our policies need to look at that data. As parents, I would say the data shows me we all need to revisit that DUI discussion and work on those barriers and acknowledge it's not easy for them. It's messy out there. They're navigating a tough situation, and the social challenge is very real and very powerful. with young people, not just the health risk to them, to their own bodies, but also they weigh very heavily what students what they believe students will support. So strengthen your parenting, take more parent ed, get some consults if need be. If you're a parent of a preteen, I think it's a good idea to read up and hang in there with Charlene's efforts. And so now I'm ending my conversation and hoping that's made you stop and think. You'll get these slides, and this will be included if you want to check out the data for yourself, or even contact me if you're interested. This will all be available to you. So thank you very much. And I know I've probably gone over my time a little bit. Hopefully, Charlene, you might have some questions for us.
Absolutely. Thank you, Becky. That was really brilliant. And I can tell by all of the questions that you're answering how important this is. And really, a lot of it is new to parents. That's why I so wanted to bring Becky here today. You know, if we were on a stage together, I would be saying to you, please go home tonight and ask or tell your teens, tell your kids one thing you heard today. And that's still what I would like you to do. Becky and I have been in this business a very long time, but I started the Parent Education Series so that parents could have information to share with their teens, to open the lines of communication. That's why we're here. So Becky, if you don't mind taking down your slide, I want to see your pretty face for a minute. We're going to go through some questions quickly because these are great questions, okay? First of all, one of the questions was, will you share your slide? You just answered that, thank you. And secondly, this is a question that comes up a lot. You and I have talked about this. How do we know that teens are telling the truth when they're surveyed? Who's in the room with them? How do we know?
So that's a very important question, and students ask it, and I count on them to ask it, and they should ask it, because then I get to say, you should be challenging everything. People need to be honest with you about where this data comes from. So how do we know that it's, one way we know, well, first of all, let me just say this. When we first started doing a lot of this work, it exposed that another misperception about young people, and that is, well, they all lie on surveys, or people all lie on surveys. And we just find that that's not true. So some of the data that I showed you actually is, you can use that by comparing how does the national data, the state data, and the local data, does it stack up? Or if you're like San Mateo Union and you have surveyed every single year and you've got the response options exactly the same almost every year, that shows that how consistent the responses are. And we saw that in Palo Alto too, by doing annual surveys 4 years in a row. These kids would have to be calling each other from college to coordinate their responses in such a way that that it would have that kind of consistency. So that alone shows validity. The other thing is, a lot of these formal approaches or formal surveys have honesty filters in them. So the training that I've had for 20 years is that you need to be honest about your response, how many people participated in this, and how many were kicked out. That's something I'd actually love to see California Healthy Kids include. How many had to be removed for honesty? Students are very intrigued by that. I had a student say, wait a minute, you mean if I said something haywire, that my whole survey would be thrown out? I said, that's right, it would. And so there are a number of ways that social science does that. And so when we have more time, we can actually go into those a little bit more. But off the top of my head, those are some of the biggies but we have plenty of evidence of students being very consistent and truthful. Did some get through that are not accurate? Probably. But what you're really looking at, the trends really help you too. Even if, like, monitoring the future might be a little lower in their numbers than the youth risk behavior in California Healthy Kids, but the trends are exactly the same. And when you're looking at norms, you've got a little bit of fudge room there. You're not looking at exact numbers necessarily. Does that make sense?
It does. And you know, one of the things that Becky and I talk about is social norms are powerful. It can give permission to kids not to do things rather than
That's
to
right.
do them. So if they hear 15% of kids are engaged in sexual activity, but 85% are not, and if you lead with that, they have a permission to step back. That's why this really matters. Again, so many great questions from you all. We're going to race through them, Becky, see what we can get to. Hardly ever had this many good questions. I will tell you, parents, I promise we will continue this discussion, especially around sexual assault behaviors and attitudes in that arena, because that is really important. Here's a great question. This is actually one of the questions that I would have asked today. How are schools sharing data with parents so that they can have a conversation with their students and be aware of what their peers are feeling and saying? Great question.
You know, I can't speak to all the schools that I highlighted today, but with fairness to know that, you know, what schools are really responsible for, this is hard for them. I think it takes, when we've been successful, it's because we've had a goal to do so. I don't think that it's being shared, to be quite honest with you, and it needs to be. So I think that's an opportunity for schools. We have had times where we've had better results in getting schools to do that. We had things happen like the parent, the PTA leader and the principal of the school actually wrote a letter to parents saying, earlier this year, you allowed your student to take the California Healthy Kids and this, la, la, la. And we just got the results, and we have some good news to report, and we have some challenges that we want to work on together. And so they provided a summary. What I'd love to see is a formal initiative or a board policy where these students honor us with their answers to very intimate questions. I believe the students deserve it because it holds up a mirror. If we just did that, that's an intervention. But if we develop a narrative and involve students and an actual project on what's the state of the health of our school, that's going to be important. I don't know these other schools. I don't know San Mateo Union and what they do. Sequoia is just starting up, Palo Alto, and everybody's in flux with COVID. So maybe it's a restart. It's an opportunity to talk about this, but at the very least, it should be shared.
And parents, again, the California Healthy Kids Survey is public. You can go on your school's website. You can go on and Google the California Healthy Kids Survey, often called CHICS, and find that data yourself. You can ask your principals, ask the superintendent. It's okay for you as a parent to ask about this information. It is public.
And I did notice that some schools, I did look at San Mateo High, I just sampled it. They do have their data up. Palo Alto has their data up. Not every school does do that. So there's really good stuff going on with some schools.
Absolutely. And again, we're very delighted that in the Sequoia Union High School District, we are restarting. Students did take the CHIC survey this spring, so we will have more relevant data. It's really important for us to see what kids all across the Bay Area or in your part of the world are doing. Here's a parent who's asking about sources, information for parents, and I will put a plug in here to our program, The Parent Venture. We have a wonderful video library. The link is in the chat. Actually, my partner Paul just put it in there. So those videos are free. They're across all kinds of topics, from social emotional learning to mental health to social justice. Please do get on there and look. We've had 15,000 people watch those videos since COVID, so we know that they're helping. Becky, we have just a minute, and I'm going to ask one quick question, and then I'm going to let you have a final word, okay?
Yeah.
How can parents screen their kids' friends for unhealthy behaviors without seeming too nosy?
Well, that's probably not a good question for me. That's not where I hang out. Screening their kids.
Kids' friends for unhealthy behaviors. I think talking and asking questions probably.
Yeah, I think but everything starts inside of a relationship. And so, you know, some of you have that, and some of you need to cultivate that relationship first. Bring them over, be the place where they want to come, listen. But, you know, I tend to be more, and I think this is coming from the work that I've done. Listening comes first, and before you can just kind of come at something and screen or do your own home surveys. And I guess that's my answer. I'm not sure that screening formal screening for friends is something that's easily done. But I think that if everything's inside of a relationship and finding those natural opportunities to have those conversations, maybe there's something that happens at a school that you hear them talking about. And I would tend to ask more questions than give advice until it is very clear that that's what needs to happen.
Great answer. So now I'm going to close with a question that I actually use to close most of our events. I admit it, and I stole it from Becky because it's such a great question. I do give her credit though when I ask it. And I'm looking at those final slides that you showed, Becky, about what students' perceptions are. What gives you hope for our kids today?
Oh my gosh. Working with, well, I love parents and I love kids. That's been my whole life. And I have complete faith in them. And I see the whole spectrum of being able to help those who are engaged in risk behaviors and reinforcing those students who are not. This work gives me hope. This approach gives me hope, and you give me hope, Charlene, because my goodness, I mean, structures give me hope. When you have Parent Venture, they're available for parents, or you have structures with schools who are saying yes to surveying, or schools who are saying yes to sharing, and yes to Becky coming in and talking with students. That gives me hope. It's infectious. Communities give me hope.
Well, thank you, Becky. You and I have dedicated our lives to kids and families, but you have done so much. We are so grateful. The comments in the chat are all saying, thank you so much for this amazing presentation. So kudos to you.
Thank you.
And we promise we will continue the conversation. This is really something that you have to do over and over, both for yourself and for your children and for the schools. So thank you again, everybody, for joining us. This event will be available soon on our video library. Please do share it with your kids, your spouse, your sisters and brothers and friends. So again, thank you, Becky Beacom.
Thank you, Charlene.
Presentation.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye. Take care. Stay well.